Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us for what we think is going to be a really exciting and interesting conversation. Woo! Excuse me. I want to start with a recognition of what is a really painful, chaotic, uncertain time. Our minds, our hearts, and our spirits are in many places today, consumed with all manners of grief, fear, exhaustion, anger, maybe hope. All that to say, I invite you to come as you are, to bring whatever you can, and to say that I'm glad that you are here, that we're all glad that you're here. This is a conversation, as you know, about interfaith competencies and how to teach them online. As you may know, the field of interfaith studies has grown over the last 10 years from a niche conversation largely among religious studies scholars to what we now think of as a distinct interdisciplinary field. At this point, IFYC has tracked over 400 courses across the country and 50 programs, including majors, minors, certificates, and concentrations, all across the country and in different kinds of institutions. So as the COVID-19 crisis pushed higher education into online learning, faculty and staff were faced with the question of how do we facilitate interfaith learning and interfaith leadership in a virtual space. Some folks have been doing this for a while, and many of us are pretty new to it. So the faculty that we invited to serve as panelists today all have wisdom to share about the ways to do this well. They are going to speak about common challenges, pedagogies that are effective, things that they still have questions about. I'm going to ask them a series of questions and let them respond, probably for the next 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will open up to your questions. While all of you participants are muted during this conversation, we do want to hear from you. So if you hover over your Zoom screen at the bottom, you will have options to open the chat, and this allows you to comment and share ideas with all attendees. You can also activate the Q&A, and here is where we encourage you to share your questions for any of the panelists or the group as a whole. Please note, you can type in your questions at any point during the webinar, during the conversation, and that actually helps us track how many questions we have and where's the most appropriate place to insert them. We will track those, so type at any time. Finally, we're grateful to Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for providing our closed captioning today. If you want to view that, click on the closed captioning link at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you will receive an email. You will receive an email a day from now with recording of the webinar. All right, so let's get started. So I want to invite each of you panelists to first tell us briefly about your online teaching experiences. For example, your platforms that you've used, the topics that you've taught, how large your class typically is, and how long you've taught online. Why don't we start with Younus?
So thanks so much, Carolyn, for organizing this and moderating the session. I appreciate your words also about this moment in history and this time. So to answer your question, that I've been teaching online for several years now, around 3 to 4 years, and I've been primarily using Canvas and Zoom. So those are the platforms that have been working well for me and my institution. Some of the challenges that we've faced in the online learning environment, especially this last semester, was regarding going from in-person to an actual virtual classroom. So none of my students, I didn't sign up to teach an online course, and we found ourselves all in an online course. So that was a big challenge for all of us, and I think a lot of the students miss that campus environment. I think a lot of us took it for granted that we're together, that we can actually see interreligious, interfaith work going on our campus. We could attend events. Ramadan was this last semester. I was hoping to have an iftar with my students, take them to the chapel, and have some programming. However, we were unable to do that. So I think that's where some of the big challenges was for us not knowing, not understanding that this crisis was going to happen, transitioning to an online platform pretty quickly. We use Canvas pretty regularly at Shenandoah University, so we moved to that platform pretty easily. And then the challenge of a lot of the students who, some of them had great Wi-Fi access, they had great houses, really loving family environments, but some of them really feeling isolated, socially distant. Some of them had to drive to get Wi-Fi at their local library, and there was a question of equity and access that appeared. So these were some of the things that appeared this last semester for me. So thanks once again for putting this together.
Thank you, Younus. I forgot to mention to also share where you're at. So Younus is at Shenandoah University. Yeah, all right, Dawn. Dawn, you're muted still. Sorry, Dawn, we still can't hear you.
Okay, there I am. Thanks so much. Thank you again, too, for inviting me to this call as well. This is definitely a great opportunity in terms of just having the opportunity to share with other online teachers in regards to our work. My experience comes from several years ago at Trine University in Angola, Indiana, where there was about 3,000 students. And so the online format for those students, normally 6 to 30 students at a time. And 30 students was probably the largest class, but normally in between 6 to 30 students. At Trine University, we utilized Moodle. I am now currently at Martin University, where it is a predominantly Black institution with only about 300 students. So we just went to the online learning format during the COVID-19 outbreak and transitioned online and did not honestly have a learning management system and are now being trained on Canvas. So we will be utilizing that format. I also had the opportunity, honestly, in the beginning to learn or to begin online teaching as a store manager for Walmart, where we actually utilized online learning for diversity events, normally for women, African Americans, and different things. So that actually helped me to start that process in the online learning initiative. So thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. Barbara.
Hello, yes, I'm with St. Mary's College of California, and I began teaching graduate students in the MBA program online on Adobe Connect, which I absolutely hated. So when Zoom kind of got its act together, I advocated for Zoom, and we've all been on Zoom for about the last 3 years, and it's been improving. In fact, my institution has had online learning almost longer than anywhere else in the country. So we have a lot of expertise, although mine isn't as extensive as others. The big challenge, teaching graduate students is different because they're used to having online meetings, and they are used to protocols like, you know, don't show up in your pajamas and things like that. And I had only taught online with undergrads if I went to a conference or something. And so I learned right away that if you don't tell them how to behave online, they'll show up in their pajamas, they'll be laying in bed, they'll be on the couch petting the cat or whatever. And so the big challenge for me was to get students, undergraduate students, to realize that it's still a classroom and to take it seriously. And so I'm hoping to share some of the protocols that I've come up with. I'm super strict about them, but I also think it's very conducive to very good conversations online. The other thing is that there was this attitude, oh, it's all going to be worse if we're online. And the reality is there's some things that are better online than in the classroom. Online, some students respond more online than they do in the classroom, and some the reverse. So some things are lost and some things are gained, but I think it's absolutely possible to have very robust conversations, teamwork, and all kinds of things. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with everyone.
Great, thanks for queuing up those really important questions and discussion points. And it seems like you are getting some amens about online etiquette. All right, last but certainly not least, Hans, would you like to introduce yourself?
Indeed, thank you. And thank you, Carolyn, and to IFYC for putting this together and convening all of us here during these challenging times. And I've had the great pleasure of getting to know and learning from Barbara and Younus over the years, and now I look forward to learning from Dawn today as well. So I teach a course called Interreligious Encounter at the University of St. Thomas, which is, if I use the correct words here that we're trying to use, a large, urban, comprehensive Catholic private university with a liberal arts foundation. We have about 6,000 undergraduates, bachelor degree seeking students, and another 4,000 graduate students. At St. Thomas, I also direct the Jay Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies. This particular course, Interreligious Encounter, I've taught several formats, traditional face-to-face, you know, your traditional 14-week semester-long course. I've taught it as a unique, kind of smaller year-long leadership cohort format. In fact, that particular format transitioned to online with COVID in early March, and we continued to meet on Zoom for the rest of the semester. And in fact, we were able to do some things we hadn't done before, like bring in speakers from around the country. But of course, we could have done that before. It just maybe wasn't on our radar screen. And online, so I teach this course online. I've taught it as a 6-week course in the summer. I've taught it as a 4-week intensive J-term course, January term course. And it's asynchronous, so we don't have any live sessions where all of us students come together. Most of my students in these online courses tend to be working either full-time, day or night, so a common time to come together just doesn't work. We use Canvas, and I understand that's kind of one of these platforms that's really taking over this space, although I have used Moodle and Blackboard and some of these other platforms, but not specifically with an online course. Typical class size is about 25 students. My experience teaching online, I taught online about a decade ago, tinkering with some blended formats, but I really didn't do much with it until about a year ago. I came back to it, and I've taught three sections of this Interreligious Encounter course. I'm teaching another 3 right now as we speak this summer. Yeah, so maybe some of the topics that we cover, introduction to the concept of religion, the study of religion, engaging religious diversity, civic pluralism, some basic religious literacy around, the so-called, big 5 world religions and secular humanism and non-religious identities, modes of dialogue and building bridges. And we do some stuff, but not enough, in my opinion, on religious conflict, violence, and peace building. So that gives you some sense of what I'm up to.
Thank you, Hans. So all of you have begun to get at this question, but I want to invite you to share a bit more about the challenges that you've faced in teaching interfaith topics or religious diversity topics online, or the challenges that you are worried about or anticipate. So why don't we start? Barbara, do you want to start?
That was a question I told you not to give me.
I'm sorry.
But okay, I'll still go with it.
I'm sorry.
I've been teaching interfaith leadership since 2014, and I teach it to as a professional kind of course, leadership in the professions. So interfaith leadership in business and the professions, and I've been doing that all these years. However, I am now currently putting that course together for the fall. And so I haven't taught it yet for interfaith, but I have been teaching a globalization course that also wraps religion issues in as well. And like I was saying earlier, the biggest challenge for me is how do I do all the things I wanted to do in person online, which is the big question. And I actually have found that if you're creative, that you don't have to give up much. So for example, presentations, for example, getting your students to do group work. So we still put all the groups together, we still have teams, we still have them work together, sometimes in the classroom, sometimes on their own, which really helps them to still maintain community as well with each other. It's still possible to have them work in the classroom together using a Google Doc. There's like a way of doing a breakout session in Zoom, and I assume in other platforms as well. And they can work on a Google Doc together. There's a drawing function on there. And so there are whole ways of doing things that you might do in the classroom. Like in the classroom, I have students get up and put things on the board, work on something in a group, and then put it on the board, and then do a mini presentation. All of that is still possible to do online, and can even be super fun because the students love to use tech, as we all know. And if you give them 3 or 4 methods for doing all of that, it's still possible. So I have like this really interactive way of doing my interfaith leadership class, and I'm looking forward to using the methods that I've used in my globalization class in the interfaith leadership class in some of these ways that I'm talking about.
Great. See, you did perfectly fine going first on that one. All right, Dawn, do you want to share?
Good. Thank you. And I guess I should have prefaced as well during my introduction that I mainly teach business classes, and a lot of the classes as well, my field or expertise was in marketing and/or retail management. So for the most part, when I think about the challenges to face online just in general, it's really about remaining effective and authentic in terms of not having that face-to-face interaction with the students. At the same token, I believe that the online format gives teachers the opportunity to better facilitate and allowing students their inputs and different things that normally in a face-to-face interaction as teachers, we sometimes things, whereas on the online format, we have the opportunity to call on students and allow them to engage and let their values or morals come out in their responses and different things. So I think the challenge for me just with online learning specifically is how to remain inclusive and not intrusive in terms of being face-to-face, but not physically.
Thanks, Dawn. That's a helpful way of thinking about it, inclusive but not intrusive. Thanks for introducing that frame to me. Hans, would you like to share sort of particular challenges which you've begun to get at and I've heard you speak to elsewhere that are really helpful?
Sure, I'll do my best here. So the course is called Interreligious Encounter. And so at first, I was fairly, maybe a lot of us are this way, I was fairly resistant to teaching this particular course online because I wasn't confident or I wasn't quite sure how to ensure that encounter would take place, at least outside the classroom. I always tell my students in a course like this, if they're not encountering or engaging religion, you know, I've somehow failed them, or at least, and I'm talking about encounter beyond the textbook, of course. But at St. Thomas, you know, even prior to COVID, there was this growing demand for online courses. So I eventually threw my hat in the ring and said, well, let's try this course. And so I had to think about how to provide opportunities for students to encounter religious diversity, given now that my students were scattered, well, in theory all over the world, but in reality, most of them were scattered throughout Minnesota, living at home with parents away from campus. I know we've all experienced this now with COVID. You know, in the face-to-face setting, I would have students work in groups or on their own. They would pick maybe a local interfaith organization or a religious community outside their home tradition, or at least the tradition they were raised in, and just simply go there, visit, be present, attend the public events, listen to the language that's being used, the issues being discussed, and so on, just to be present in these spaces. But not just once, but they would go again and again and again. So it's kind of like a reiterative multiple site visit, but you're just going to one site over and over. And sometimes there's an option to do interviews if students want to do that. And we're in Minneapolis and St. Paul, a large urban center with significant diversity for our region, at least, religious diversity. So this generally isn't a challenge for students to find places to engage. But now with students scattered, this type of group work, I appreciate Barbara's comment on online group work, but this type of group work where they actually go as a group to these sites, this became a challenge. So I asked students to engage the local diversity of wherever they happen to be. And this usually isn't a problem, again, for students who happen to be in larger urban centers that have this diversity, but I have a lot of students who are in smaller rural Minnesota farm communities. They would send me a list of 10 churches and 8 of them are Lutheran, and they would ask me, which one could they go to? And this is a challenge, especially since most of my students, especially from small town rural Minnesota, were raised in Christian and often Lutheran traditions. And the assignment's on interreligious encounter, not intra-Christian encounter. So we'd have to get creative. Some students would, drive to the next, big town over, I suppose, if they had access to a vehicle. I had one student who told me the only diversity seemed to be at the small strip town in his strip mall in his town, down at the intersection. It had about 10 shops. So we changed his assignment to, well, why don't you go interview the shopkeepers about religion in the workplace and religion in their town. And that turned out well. The student ended up realizing he had more religious diversity than he had realized in this town. Another quick example, this past January, I had 2 students who decided to take this class, and they were traveling during the month of January. They were traveling as ski bums for a month between Colorado, Utah, California, and they were wondering, well, how do we engage religious diversity at these quite affluent American ski resorts? So we devised a project where they would interview folks on the chairlift. They'd be spending a lot of time on these chairlifts. Why don't you interview them or strike up conversations, or why don't you investigate the religious diversity that happens to be in these towns? And so they did that, and that worked. And a final example, if I can share, with this week, with the tragic, killing of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, I have several students now who are like all of us, understandably deeply disturbed, by what they're seeing, the police, the riots, the very real tension that's surrounding them here. And we've had a few students, we've had a few events, and I suspect we'll have more of interfaith gatherings, vigils, protests. And so some students have decided to attend these and use these as their site engagement, or some of them are attending them online. A lot of these are up online now. So I guess the lesson here, the challenge is getting students to find the religious diversity around them. That can be an asset too to leverage, because then they're bringing it back into the classroom. But I guess the lesson for me has been to remain flexible and nimble and be willing to deal with students with where they're at, and not being afraid to rethink or revise an assignment, at the last minute. So yeah, I'll stop there, but that continues to be a challenge, but I just take it as it comes, a case-by-case basis, and work with the students.
That's great. Thank you, Hans. I really appreciate about that example that the challenge afforded the opportunity to demonstrate one of the most important things about interfaith studies, which is that religiosity and religious identity shows up in the civic, and it encouraged your students to look for religion in non-traditional places. So I appreciate that example, and it indicates that there's an asset, as you said, to the online learning space. And then Younus, you want to tell us about challenges that you've encountered?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'm similar to Barbara, Don, and Hans. When I taught online, I was thinking about the challenge of building community. So how do you navigate religious difference when you're not face-to-face, as Don was mentioning? So I teach a course, and I taught this course last semester at Shenandoah, the Quran and the Bible, and this was, of course, is made possible by a generous IFYC course curriculum grant. And it's a very text-heavy course. So we look at different texts from the Quran and Bible, and we look at particular figures, whether it's Mary in the Bible, and then Mary in the Quran, or Abraham, and so forth. So I wanted to kind of show them, how do these figures come to life? How do people still find meaning in these figures? So the online environment actually helped in certain ways. Like, for example, Barbara mentioned the breakout room. So a lot of my students really liked the breakout rooms. They said that usually in class, we would just sit next to our friends or people we know, and if we had a small group discussion, we would just talk to them. While the breakout rooms allowed everyone, most of the time they're random, and they got to talk to people that they've never spoke to in class. The polling was also very helpful, just to really gauge the temperature of the class and what do you think about this particular issue, and that can lead to specific discussions. So those are things I hadn't done in person. Also, the challenge of going to a religious site, and IFYC has a great resource, which I'll share, about actually going to a religious institution and learning about it. So I was really nervous, is that how can we do this in this online environment? So I did a virtual tour of a mosque, and in that virtual tour, we actually got to look at mosques throughout the world, in Iran, in Turkey, in Europe, in the United States, and they found that really interesting. And that's something I probably wouldn't have done. I would just probably gone to my local mosque community, and they would just go there and see that place. And that's would be their only impression of what a mosque would look like. Also, I was planning this wonderful iftar with wonderful food from around the world, Middle Eastern desserts and so forth. But unfortunately, because of the COVID, we decided to do actually a virtual forum, and our campus community did a virtual iftar. And then part of my project here at Shenandoah is to do global exchange with folks in Malaysia and Bosnia. So we had a forum where everyone, our partners, spoke about Ramadan, how Ramadan is practiced in those countries. So I think we would have never had done such a forum where everyone would be learning where the different practices in Malaysia versus in Bosnia if we had not transitioned to the online.
Great. Yeah, Barbara.
I just want to make a comment in building on that, and that is, I've discovered a number of things from teaching online undergrads that I'm going to incorporate when I get back to the classroom. And I'm sure you are too, Younus, some of these things that you're talking about. One of the things I did is in the course that I was teaching in the spring on globalization, I thought it would be super, I normally have these little lectures and then there's interactive stuff with them in the classroom. So it's dynamic, but there's little PowerPoints and so forth. And I just thought the PowerPoint thing is just completely boring online, showing a PowerPoint online. It should avoid it like the plague. So I made these little short 10-minute, 15-minute Zoom videos, and I assigned them as homework. And then what I did was I went through all the reading and I developed a lot of study questions. And so I had them watch the video, do the reading, think about the study questions, then come to the classroom. So it's a completely flipped classroom is really what it is. And I have to say, this semester, I had more dynamic conversations around the readings with my undergrad students online than I've ever had in the classroom. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not in the classroom, as we all know, depending on the group, etc. I was really surprised. And so I'm actually going to use that same method when I'm back in the classroom. So we learn things from online, like your virtual tour idea, going around the world, and then having the encounter in their community as well, right? So it's exciting, really.
That's a great transition to the next question, is the opportunities that are afforded. And before you say more about that, can you, for the sake of literacy, can you tell the group what a flipped classroom is and just give a little more clarity around what that is?
Oh yeah, sorry about that. It's when the lecture, there's no lecture, everything is part of homework, and then the whole classroom is discussion. So at my institution, engaging students in the classroom is really the whole methodology. We're not super lecture oriented to begin with, but everybody has a little bit of that. And so we have kind of a almost like a flipped classroom methodology generally, where the lecture is somewhere else, you know, online, or there's additional readings or whatever, and then you're just in conversation. And the way that I did it with these little videos, it really worked. I'm going to continue it when I get back in the classroom. And I may end up teaching some of my courses online in the future anyway, now that we've all had this experience.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful. So let's go to you, Younus. Beyond what you shared, which is already great, do you have any other opportunities that have been afforded by online learning, so that the online space gives you opportunity to do new and different things? And due to time, I'm going to ask you at the same moment if you have particular assignments or activities that you found to be really exciting or effective in online space.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And so one thing I did this semester in the online environment, and it was actually building on some of the IFYC research. So there's a really nice book that I would recommend, and I'll share that resource on interfaith, interreligious studies, defining a new field. I know Barbara has a chapter in there. And there's one specific chapter actually assigned to my students called Interfaith Studies in the Profession Could Heighten Religious Understanding See Success with Secular Careers by Mark Henshaw and Esther Lazi. And it was a really nice chapter because it talks about how this one program of interfaith studies actually led to this graduate, Esther Lazi, and how she got a job, which is wonderful, right? Our students getting jobs in interreligious interfaith studies, and how that background helped her in her job as an employee of Boston, the city of Boston, and incorporating immigrants into that society. So I signed that chapter. The students found it really interesting. A lot of my students are not religious studies majors. A lot of them are taking it as general education requirement. So they found this revolutionary, and like, wow, you know, this course on the Quran and Bible is actually going to help me in my nursing career or my business career or my job as a computer scientist. They had never really thought about that in those terms. So that article encouraged me to do a competition with my students. I said, look, let's try to implement this religious diversity work here. I had a class of 15 students. They divided into 3 groups. I said, I want you to propose a religious diversity training for Shenandoah University, that you guys are consultants. You are a consultant firm, and you're going to do a training for Shenandoah, and we're going to have a competition. I'm going to invite the deans. I'm going to invite the associate provost, and you're going to present your plan for religious diversity. And we'll see who wins the contract. So the students got really excited, which you know, reading texts is really exciting for me. I love reading the Bible and the Quran and comparing them, but this competition element really made them enthusiastic. And it was toward the end of the semester, a lot of the students were kind of feeling a little lackadaisical about this online environment, but they became alive, and they really put a lot of effort. Use a lot of the resources that Barbara, Don, Hans talked about, maybe Google Docs. They were really involved with Canvas. They did their own Zoom calls, and they presented to our deans, and there was a winner that was awarded, quote unquote, this hypothetical contract. So it was a way to take these kind of theoretical ideas about religious diversity, about text, about theology, and make it really tangible. And it was, I think, a wonderful way to end the semester thinking about how religious diversity can help them in their career.
That's great, Younus. I really appreciate that example because of what you said, which is it connects the interfaith studies, maybe, and in your case, it's particularly interfaith studies that is a textual practice and an intellectual exercise to a very real campus context and to pre-professional competencies. So thank you for sharing. That's a great example. Dawn, would you like to share particular opportunities afforded by online education and any practices, pedagogies, activities that you think are really effective?
Good, thank you. Just definitely enjoying the conversation with you all. And I believe Hans mentioned earlier about, we are now, in an online space because of COVID-19, and we are now opening our minds to resources that have always been there. And then like the goals of Barbara and Younus in terms of kind of bringing up our responsibility as faculty in terms of developing leaders of our students and be using that innovative and creativity in the classroom as much as we did, using it online as much as we did in the classroom. So when I think about the interfaith format and the reason I came across IFYC, how do we, connect with that faith-based learning in terms of online and given the opportunities to put faith into the classroom? And one of the courses at Martin University, we have Women in the Bible. And one of the things I wanted to do was to utilize Daughters of Dignity about tying in African women in the Bible and their virtual womanhood. So I think there are so many different angles in terms of interreligion, diversity, and all those different things that not only as teachers, but as students, they are still teaching us on how to make sure that we're allowing a space or an environment for them that helps them to increase their faith and their values and their morals and still be able to stay on task and make sure they're learning what they need to.
That's great. Thank you, Dawn. Hans, opportunities and any additional assignments you think are particularly effective?
Sure. Thank you. These are all great comments. I'm quickly writing down notes from my three colleagues here. I mentioned the advantage of already or potentially having students all over the region or country or maybe the world for some of you in their own unique contexts. And I guess for me, it's a way, and now it's about finding a way to leverage that, as I said, in the classroom as an asset now instead of, I suppose, a liability. So finding ways to encourage these students to bring their context into the classroom. I don't know whether that's calling on specific students to write about it in class discussions or presentations, or having them deliver presentations using the kind of the growing number of technological apps we have with VoiceThread and Zoom and PowerPoint and all of that. Because my students are having rich experiences. And and it would be a shame not to have those shared with the others. One way to begin, one way I found a way, to begin to have this, or to at least to start this, is to have students open the class, the course, with having them submit I would say a rather longer than usual introduction video of themselves, ideally a video if they can create a video, of introducing themselves right away to the class. And you'll discover, at least this is what I found, you'll discover, why they're taking the course, why they're there to learn, but also where they are and what they're up to. Maybe they're in a full-time job, maybe they're in a unique internship, And knowing this right away can, on the one hand, it can help prepare for anticipating any challenges they might have coming down the road, but it also might help you to start thinking ahead about how can they then use that context. Like the two students I had who were traveling to different ski resorts, I knew that this would be a challenge. So I started early and starting to help them think about how they might tackle that assignment and how might they use what they're doing to their advantage. For teaching leadership, you know, it may be that students, it seems to be my students who are taking an online course, even well, before COVID, I know we're all online now, but before COVID, many of my students on online courses they seem to be either working full time or they're doing an internship or they're doing research or they're very busy. So maybe it's an opportunity to design an assignment which blends a reflection on, or it makes them use that experience in the workplace or the industry or profession or whatever they're doing with leadership practices or skills or religion in the workplace. So if they're learning in the class can somehow directly apply to what they spend their day doing, my guess is it'll certainly be, it can be more relevant and interesting and have a longer term impact on them. This summer now, and I'll just end with this, the summer, it's been a real challenge now with COVID, because usually I have students engaging the local religious diversity around them, but now, as you know, for a long time, students weren't even going out of the house. So it's challenging. I know that there are some religious communities who've lifted restrictions around people gathering, but I've decided that I'm not comfortable with certainly requiring or pushing my students into these public spaces during a pandemic. So, well, what's happening online? We know religion is still happening. And so how does this impact interreligious encounters? So this is very experimental. This summer I'm having I have 75 or so students throughout the summer who will be, I suppose, attending or virtually visiting or encountering religion online through, ideally, again, live public events put on by communities or organizations, or at the very least recordings. And if all goes well, I will try to curate at the end of this some kind of, they have to write up these public narratives or stories about their encounter. I'll try to get these all on maybe a GIS story map for the world to see. So stay tuned for that. We'll see how it works out.
I just wanted to add one more thing. And of course, the question was, what type of assignments, and kind of pigging back off Hans, that reflective essays, reflective journaling, all of those things are something that definitely allow our students to share their spiritual values and different things in terms of their personal perspective, and then how they apply that to their everyday life in terms of what they're doing. So I think it's very important that that's part of assignments and different things that we do, is that reflective opportunity for them.
Thanks, Dawn. And some of you are used to me saying this, but we have found that having a piece that is about, having a part of your course that is actually about students' individual reflection and learning is a really important part, because it's going to happen anyway, and it's really important to create some space for that and to acknowledge that that's an important part of the process. Barbara, I wanted to go back to you in case you had additional either opportunities afforded by online education or assignments that have been really effective.
Yeah, I wanted to say one of the assignments that I have in the classroom, I thought, how am I going to be able to do this? And I call it the undebate. So it's, they take a particular topic and they have two sides, but the goal is not to win the debate. The goal is for mutual edification from both sides. And so they're not supposed to, try to get over on one another. So I thought, well, how am I going to do that online when I normally have people in the classroom on two sides, and then we have like an audience and all that? Well, what we did was we had everybody who wasn't undebating turn off their camera, which Zoom then throws everybody who's not on camera off the main screen. And then we had the students have wear something different. And I said, you can be creative. So one team does hats and the other one doesn't, or one wears white, one wears black. So they had ways that they did that. And then they have theirs to have a conversation back and forth. And it actually worked just as well online as it did in the classroom. And so I'm really for try not to give up anything. You know. Then the other one is the one I'm contemplating for the fall, and that is at the end of the semester. Well, our course, Interfaith Leadership for Business and the Professions, it fulfills our core curriculum requirement for community engagement. And community engagement can be community within the college or outside. So I do religious encounters and so forth during the semester as well. But this project is, we take several different professions, and then how is interfaith leadership relevant to happening in, et cetera, some profession, the police, whatever, right? HR in Silicon Valley. And then they research that. So what I'm contemplating for that is to have a kind of a online forum for student residents at St. Mary's. And I think it will also translate really, really well. I don't think we have to give up a lot to, we just have to get really creative, know how to use methods that are kind of behind the screen to get students engaged, and it can really work.
Thanks, that's great and very important encouragement. So we have about 7 minutes left. If there are any questions from participants, now is the time to please add them to the question and answer button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. While we wait for any of those, I want to invite any of you panelists, if you have anything to add or ask each other, you're welcome to.
I'll just say on the protocol thing that I was talking about early on, and this is for any course, I think it's really important to be super strict about it. We do have the issue of equitable access. So some students don't have the best internet connection, et cetera. But if you have a whole bunch of blank nobody with video or a couple, you really can't do anything dynamic. And so insisting that students try to find a way or get a hold of you and have your college help them find a way to actually be engaged is really important. And then all of the protocols around, this is still the classroom, sit in a chair, be at a table or a desk as best as you possibly can, everybody with video, and then lots of people have different ways of managing the conversation, but I found that students could get really used to being muted and unmuting themselves pretty quickly. They got really facile with that. And so combination of hand raising, unmuting, and then the conversation can become really quite dynamic. And then the other thing I want to add is that to our students today, and I don't know if this is true for the rest of you, but I think it is this generation, they're very, very kind to one another. So they don't want to shame other students or get over on them or whatever. So one of the ways I get conversations started online is to say, all right, somebody's got to step up to get this conversation going. Otherwise, I'm going to have to call on somebody. And you don't want me to cold call one of your colleagues. Somebody step up, and every time somebody will step up and start the conversation. And that's been a real challenge online, is to get that started, and that method has worked.
Thanks, Barbara. That's great. So we have one question from someone who is at a small Christian campus. They're interested in how to get started on this sort of interfaith work when they're not a faculty member, but rather director of diversity. Any advice from you all?
I can jump in here. I'm trying my best at this question if I understand it properly. How to get started just with, if I understand the question, fostering interfaith engagement and counter interreligious learning on campus outside the classroom or not as a faculty member. You know, I wear a couple of different roles at my institution, directing an academic center, and I know Barbara wears all these hats as well, and then teaching courses. But for a long time, I'm a big advocate for interfaith engagement happening in all sectors of the institution. And so at my institution that I'm at, something that I'm really happy about has happened over the past 5, 6, 7 years or so. We've seen interfaith engagement and learning. It still takes place in the classroom, of course, and in different pockets of departments, but it's really blossomed under student affairs and in student diversity services. And they've really kind of taken the reins and realized, hey, this is something we can do too. We can create programs, and they've developed incredible programs that faculty members now can tap into and send students to and learn from. So you could create programs with students, or have students create programs, or I think if you're director of diversity, that's a very appropriate position to be creating interfaith programs. And if, you know, I think if the faculty at your university are like me, I'm always looking for opportunities for students to engage religious diversity on campus. So if there are programs I can send students to as part of my pedagogy, I think other faculty would love that too. So it's kind of like you're creating programs for these classes for students to engage diversity on campus and not just off campus. That's really quick off the top of my head. Maybe some of the other folks here have some better wisdom to add.
I would just say that it was easier to get it started outside of the classroom to begin with at my institution. And that's because in student life and in diversity, in mission and ministry, and also the center I direct, coordinating and interacting. We also have an intercultural center. There was a way of partnering all across the student life experience to develop the programming along the lines of what you were saying. One thing I will just add, because what you said was just so perfect, is having programming in the residence halls. So we have all kinds of programmings and learnings and so forth and so on, and then having someone who's heading up diversity on campus, including that in the residence halls is one thing, but also just ditto everything Han just said.
All right, in the last minute, there's one question about whether any of you have advocated or encouraged your students to set up a sort of different space in their own homes to designate it as a space of learning. So to recreate a sort of physical space.
I would say no, and that's because their situations are really different. Some of them are sharing a room and they can't do anything about somebody walking in and out. It's really hard on them. I think if they'd signed up for an online course, it would be a different situation. You might be able to say, hey, designate this, but we just do the best we can. Not everybody has their own room. Some people live in tiny apartments. And so we just have to, you know, demand those protocols as best we can, but then be a little flexible around the edges.
All right, thank you all so much. I'm going to end our time together. Thank you to the panelists. You were fantastic. This was a great opportunity. To any of you who are attendees, please feel free to reach out to me or to my colleague Becca, who's on the call, and we will be in touch with additional resources. Thank you all.